Good evening, friends. Tonight we're going back to Victorian-era Britain. We're not going to talk about the Queen, wars, or grand history. We're simply going to take a look at what the British people of that time actually had on their dinner tables. Now dim the lights and let the chimes carry us into tonight's story. You are floating above mid-19th century London. Night has fallen, and gaslights bloom in halos of dim yellow through the damp fog. Your gaze penetrates the rooftops and first falls into a cramped, dimly lit room. This room serves as bedroom, living room, and kitchen all at once. In the fireplace at the center of the room, a feeble flame illuminates the faces of a family. They are gathered around a rough wooden table, enjoying tonight's supper. You lean in closer. The air is thick with the pungent smell of onions. There are no plates on the table. Each person holds a large chunk of bread. The bread is dark in color, the dense, coarse kind of brown dripping bread. It's filling and serves as their most important source of calories. The children dip their bread into a small bowl, not butter, but dripping, the animal fat that collects when roasting meat. For families who cannot afford butter, this is a rare treat and vital source of energy. In the center of the table sits a pot. Inside is today's main course. Vegetable thick soup, or more accurately, a vegetable mush. It bubbles away with whatever cheapest vegetables could be found. Carrots, turnips, and great heaps of onions. In Victorian London, onions were a godsend. For the poor you could buy a dozen for half a penny. So they appeared in virtually every dish. Roasted, fried, stewed, they were everywhere. As for meat, that was a luxury. Perhaps only on Sundays might they get a small piece of stewed pig's cheek or shin of beef, and that would count as a feast. For even poorer families, their supper might be so simple it would break your heart. Just a slice of bread with a few sprigs of fresh, but nearly calorie-free watercress. This was a typical Victorian working-class dinner table. Simple, repetitive everything in service of one fundamental goal: survival. Now let us shift our gaze away from this dim neighborhood and drift westward to London's West End. The streets here are wide and bright, and the gaslight seems to shine more brilliantly. You choose at random one of the tall terraced houses, pass through heavy curtains, and enter a brilliantly lit dining room. The long dining table is draped in snow-white linen, and silver cutlery and crystal glasses glitter and gleam. This too is a family's supper, but the scene before you seems to come from another planet. Here, dinner is not a pot of mush but a long, intensely ritualized performance. First to be served is a bowl of soup, not ordinary vegetable soup, but the most extravagant luxury of the time: turtle soup. This dish was a symbol of wealth and status, enjoyed only by the wealthiest families. Of course, the rising middle classes, unable to afford real turtle, invented a mock turtle soup. They used a calf's head and hooves to imitate the texture and flavor of turtle. The dish became surprisingly popular. It even appeared in Wallace's Adventures in Wonderland, a testament to how widespread it was. After the soup, servants silently clear the dishes and replace them with fresh ones. Next comes the fish course, then the main course, usually an awe-inspiring joint of roasted meat, such as an entire haunch of venison or a massive cut of roast beef known as a baron of beef. The significance of this meat lay not merely in eating it, but in displaying it. Its sheer size was a declaration in itself, proclaiming the host's wealth and generosity. In fact, the quantity of food at such a dinner was staggering. Much of the time, far more food was prepared than the guests could possibly consume. Because the leftovers would become the servants' meals, this too was part of maintaining the vast household system. You would notice that the cooking style of these dishes was heavily influenced by the fashionable French cuisine of the time. Wealthy families would hire French chefs at high salaries, which was considered the height of sophistication. The presentation of food was as important as its taste, perhaps even more so. And so, one dining table two worlds, the gulf between rich and poor in Victorian Britain, was expressed with piercing clarity through food. As you gaze upon these two utterly different tables, you realize that food here had long transcended its primal function of filling the stomach. For the poor, food was a survival tool measured in calories fuel against hunger. Their menu was dictated by price, the cheapness of onions, the caloric density of dripping, the filling nature of brown bread. These were their only criteria. For the rich, food was a meticulously choreographed drama, a prop used to consolidate and flaunt social status. Dishes had to have French names, ingredients had to be rare, portions had to be extravagant. All of it was a performance for others. The dining table was not merely a place to eat. It was a mirror that clearly reflected each person's position within this rigidly hierarchical society. Now, let us leave those two quiet dining rooms and return to London's noisy streets. The hour has grown later. Workers who have finished a day of grueling labor are pouring out of factories and merging into the narrow, bustling streams of people. Their dwellings are cramped, with no proper kitchens. Some can barely even afford to light a fire. So where does their supper come from? The answer lies in these lively, bustling streets. You follow in the footsteps of a worker. He has a few pennies earned from a hard day's labor in his pocket. He is in no hurry to go home. Instead, he begins a movable late-night feast. This is a dining ritual unique to the Victorian working class, free, casual, and brimming with the earthy vitality of street life. First, you catch the aroma of baked potatoes. On the street corner stands a brightly painted metal canister, heated by charcoal below to keep the baked potatoes inside piping hot. The worker spends a penny on one. The vendor deftly slices it open, smears on a pat of butter, and sprinkles it with salt and pepper. On a cold London night, the scalding baked potato not only fills the belly but doubles as a pocket hand warmer. He eats the potato as he walks on. Soon, a scent combining the saltiness of seawater with the tang of spices fills your nostrils. It's a seafood stall, displaying all manner of small shellfish, boiled cockles, mussels, whelks, and pickled periwinkles. The worker spends another penny on a small portion of whelks dressed in vinegar and pepper. Eating these little morsels requires skill and patience. You have to use a pin to pick the meat from the shell, perfect for eating while walking, whiling away the journey. These street stalls were often cleverly positioned outside gin shops, so that workers buying food could also pop in for a warming glass of ginger beer or elderberry wine. Farther along, the choices multiply. One stall wafts out the aroma of meat pies fillings, both savory and sweet, the perfect portable main course. Another stall sells steaming eel soup or roasted eels. The eel vendor hollers loudly, "Hot and fragrant eels." That distinctive aroma always draws a crowd. If you find all this too heavy, the streets also offer lighter options. Watercress sellers whose fresh leaves serve as a kind of salad, or baked apple vendors whose sweet tart offerings make a fine dessert. Of course, the street food chain also has its own hierarchy. Among all the foods, the lowest in status is probably sheep's trotters. Originally, trotters were an important ingredient for making glue, but as industrialization produced cheaper substitutes, these trotters were sold to the poorest people as food. For a worker on an extremely tight budget, a baked potato paired with a boiled sheep's trotter made for quite a decent supper. Just as you think this movable feast is winding down, a clear bell rings out. You look toward the sound and spot the legendary Muffin Man. He carries a basket covered with thick cloth, filled with muffins and crumpets fresh from the oven, still steaming. This is an afternoon treat that transcends class boundaries, loved by rich and poor alike. Interestingly, this bell-ringing method of hawking was actually banned by an Act of Parliament in 1839 on the grounds of disturbing the peace. But clearly, the ban was collectively ignored by both vendors and customers. The clear ring of the bell remained a distinctive feature of London's streets. In the Victorian era, due to the explosive growth of the urban population and extremely cramped living spaces, Most working-class homes lacked proper cooking facilities. Street food therefore became an indispensable part of their daily lives. As you watch this worker contentedly finish his last bite of muffin and disappear into the end of an alley, you may suddenly understand that street food meant more to him than just sustenance. In that age of rigid hierarchy and constant restriction, this movable feast offered something precious and fleeting: freedom. On the streets, there were no fussy table manners, no need to sit down and pay for a full meal. With the few pennies in his pocket, he could freely choose tonight's menu, whether to eat potatoes first or start with eel soup. This power of choice, in a life dominated by the factory whistle and strict social norms, was extraordinarily precious. Here, food returned to its purest essence, and the diner once again shed the shackles of class, savoring a moment of autonomy and ease. Let us momentarily shift our gaze from the colorful world of street food and focus on a type of food that seemed utterly unremarkable at the time, yet was absolutely ubiquitous: the oyster. If you could travel back to 1860s London, you would be stunned by what you saw. Oysters, the luxury item sold at premium prices in fine restaurants today, were cheaper than potatoes back then. They were piled high in mountains, hawked loudly by vendors on every street corner. You didn't need to sit down, didn't even need a plate. The vendor would skillfully pry open the shell with a small knife and hand it to you. You'd tilt your head back, slurp the briny, fresh oyster meat into your mouth, and toss the shell on the ground. The streets at the time were often carpeted with a layer of crushed oyster shells. They had become part of the city's sediment. This is no exaggeration. According to records, in the single year of 1864, Londoners consumed approximately 700 million oysters. That figure is almost unimaginable today for the city's poor. Oysters were a gift from God, one of the cheapest sources of protein available. For a penny, you could buy 4 to 8, enough to temporarily forget your hunger. The great novelist Charles Dickens once wrote in his works, "Poverty and oysters always seem to go together." This line precisely captured the reality of that era. Yet oysters were not the exclusive domain of the poor. They were one of those rare foods that could cross the class divide. Wealthy gentlemen would eat a few oysters at a street stall before a formal dinner as an appetizer, much as we eat canapés today. In middle-class kitchens, housewives would stuff cheap oyster meat into meat pies to bulk up the filling and add a delicious savory flavor, an economical cooking trick. Chai? Rich or poor, oysters, with their astonishing abundance, nourished this rapidly expanding city. This readily available bounty was partly thanks to advances in transportation technology. The expansion of the railways allowed oysters to be rapidly shipped from coastal regions to inland cities. At the same time, the advent of canning technology meant that oyster meat could be preserved for longer and sold to more distant places. But beneath this prosperity, a tremendous crisis lurked. In Victorian London, the Thames had become an enormous open sewer. Industrial waste and raw sewage were dumped directly into it without treatment. And oysters, as filter-feeding organisms, acted like underwater vacuum cleaners, concentrating everything in the river water, including deadly pathogens, inside their bodies. Eating oysters at the time was therefore like a game of Russian roulette. You might enjoy a delicious meal, or you might swallow the bacteria that caused typhoid or cholera along with it. Moreover, given that oysters were the poor's cheap and plentiful source of protein in the Victorian era, what caused this once absurdly abundant cheap delicacy to vanish from the poor man's table and become today's luxury? Some argue that the primary culprit was overfishing. As demand surged, fishermen began using a new technology called dredging, dragging iron-framed nets along the seabed, which vastly improved harvesting efficiency, but also caused devastating damage to oyster habitats. Other scholars point to worsening industrial pollution as the main cause. Contaminated oysters not only posed health risks, but also led to a sharp decline in their numbers. Still, another view holds that the oyster's decline was due to a powerful competitor. with the advent of refrigerated shipping technology in the 1880s. Cheap imported meat from the Americas and Australia flooded the British market, providing people with a safer, more reliable source of protein. The oyster's status was thus gradually supplanted. Now let us return once more to that cramped single room in a London slum. This time, we won't look at the dining table but instead focus on the so-called kitchen. To call it a kitchen is, in truth, a compliment because in homes like these, there simply is no separate room called a kitchen. The kitchen before your eyes is actually just the fireplace in the corner of the room. This fireplace is the center of the entire household. It not only provides the sole source of warmth during damp, bitterly cold winters, but also serves all the functions of cooking, boiling water, and even drying clothes. Above the fireplace usually hangs an iron pot, often the family's only piece of cookware. Whether making vegetable mush, heating water, or occasionally stewing a small piece of meat, all cooking tasks are accomplished with this single pot. You look around and notice something strange. This home has virtually no baked food. This is because the vast majority of poor households simply did not have an oven. The structure of the fireplace limited cooking to boiling, stewing, and frying. If a housewife wanted bread or a baked pie, she had to take her kneaded dough to the communal bakehouse in the neighborhood to be baked, paying a small fee for the service. This dependence on shared facilities also shaped a distinctive sense of community. Much of the neighborly interaction took place during the idle chatter while waiting for bread to come out of the oven. Now let's look at their pantry. The so-called storage consists of a few wooden boards nailed to the wall or a crude cupboard. On them sit their meager provisions. You would see a bag of brown flour, some potatoes and onions, and a block of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. In an age without refrigerators, food preservation was the greatest challenge. Working-class families therefore favored hard cheeses, as they lasted far longer than soft ones. Even when the cheese was eaten down to a heel as hard as stone, housewives couldn't bear to throw it away. They would hold it over the fire to soften it, then share it among the children. You might also notice that their diet includes very little milk or butter. Butter was too expensive. They substituted cheaper dripping. And even when milk could be bought, it was often adulterated with water by unscrupulous milk vendors. However, many families kept 1 or 2 hens in their tiny backyards. These hens were exceedingly valuable assets, providing up to a dozen eggs per week, an important source of protein for the family, especially on days when meat was unaffordable. Water was also a major problem. There was no running water here. All drinking water had to be fetched from the neighborhood's public water pump, and the water source for these pumps was often already contaminated by nearby cesspits. Drinking unboiled water was therefore extremely dangerous. This is why, in the Victorian era, people widely believed that drinking low-alcohol small beer was safer than drinking water. Even children were no exception because the heating process during brewing killed most of the bacteria in the water. Now let us hold our breath. Leave that smoky, warm-hearted fireside, and through an invisible door, instantly transport ourselves to the basement of an aristocratic mansion. This is the engine room of the entire house, a vast, bustling, rigidly hierarchical kitchen. The first thing you feel is a wave of heat hitting your face. The source of that heat is the monstrous behemoth at the center of the room. A massive cast iron range, the technological core of the Victorian kitchen. It replaced the old open fireplace, was far more efficient, and could perform roasting, boiling, and stewing simultaneously. But it was also a tyrant. It greedily devoured coal, requiring servants to light the fire from the early morning, and continuously add fuel and clear ash throughout the day to maintain a steady temperature. The entire kitchen's rhythm was dictated by the breathing of this steel giant. This kitchen was a factory run with military discipline, not a cozy domestic space. You would see a strict hierarchy, operating with high efficiency. At the top stood the cook and weighs. If the household was particularly wealthy and discerning, this might be a highly paid French male chef. He was responsible for menu design and the core cooking, the absolute ruler of this kingdom. Below him were several kitchen maids who handled chopping, preparing ingredients, and other support tasks. Lowest in status was the scullery maid, usually the youngest and most inexperienced girl, responsible for all the dirtiest and most exhausting work. Washing mountains of pots and pans, scrubbing floors, and disposing of kitchen waste. By design, this kitchen was deliberately segregated from the master's living quarters. It was usually located in the basement or in a separate wing at the rear of the house, separated from the main staircase by a thick door lined with green baize. When the food was ready, it would be sent silently up to the dining room above via a device called a dumbwaiter. The purpose of all this design was to completely isolate the kitchen's noise, smells, grease, and unglamorous physical labor from the elegant, tranquil life of the masters upstairs. The technological equipment here, compared to the slum's fireplace, was a world apart. Rows of gleaming copper pots hung on the walls, their interiors lined with a layer of tin to prevent the copper from reacting chemically with certain foods. The worktables were laden with all manner of novel, industrially mass-produced kitchen gadgets: cherry pitters that could effortlessly stone cherries, cheese graters, potato peelers, and jelly molds and pastry cutters of every strange shape. Of course, there were also things we recognize: canned goods. Although canned food was already quite common by the mid-19th century, a dedicated can opener was curiously slow to be invented. For a long time, whether it was a wealthy household chef or an ordinary housewife, opening a tin required a hammer and chisel, a rather undignified affair. It wasn't until the 1870s that convenient can openers began to become common in kitchens. And when you observe this efficiently running kitchen, you'll find it bears a striking resemblance to the Industrial Revolution of the time. The massive range was the kitchen's steam engine. The servants were workers on an assembly line, each with a clear division of labor, all aimed at efficiently producing one exquisite meal after another. The physical separation between kitchen and dining room, along with the silent dumbwaiter, concealed a profound social psychology: the invisibility of labor. That elegant, seemingly effortless dinner party upstairs was a carefully constructed illusion, and its realization was built precisely upon the foundation of completely hiding the vast, grueling, and even somewhat squalid labor behind it. Wealthy Victorians enjoyed the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, but they did not wish to see the factories and workers that produced those fruits. Likewise, they enjoyed exquisite food, but did not wish to see the kitchen and servants that produced it. This separation of consumption from production, this severance of enjoyment from labor, was a core feature of that era's capitalism and social stratification. What we're going to discuss next is not fine cuisine, but a shocking secret hidden within the everyday food of the Victorian era, a horrifying, nationwide food adulteration scandal. Imagine walking into a Victorian-era grocery shop. The shelves are lined with all manner of enticing goods. You buy a pound of white bread to make sandwiches at home. But what you don't know is that, to make the bread look whiter and weigh more, the baker has mixed alum and even plaster of Paris into the flour. Although alum itself is not highly toxic, it inhibits digestion, drastically reducing the nutritional value of everything else you eat. You also buy some brightly colored sweets for the children. Those vivid reds, greens, and yellows look so appealing. But you don't know that these colors come from highly toxic chemical pigments. The red may come from mercuric sulfide, the yellow from lead chromate, the green from copper arsenite. With every sweet a child eats, they are ingesting a tiny dose of poison. You buy a jar of mustard, but very little of it is actual mustard. Seed, most of it is flour dyed with turmeric. And lead chromate may have been added to intensify the yellow. You buy a jar of pickles, and that bright green color is preserved with copper sulfate. The milk you buy has been diluted with water, and to make it appear thick again, chalk powder or even sheep's brains have been added. The beer you drink has been laced with toxic strychnine to increase its bitterness. Even the tea leaves you brew may well be used leaves that were collected, redried, redyed with Prussian blue or graphite, and sold again. The list could go on and on, like a mad chemist's shopping list. This is no exaggeration. It was the daily reality faced by the British people of the Victorian era. Food adulteration had become absolutely pervasive. So how was this terrible secret exposed? Here we must remember the name of a hero, Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall. In the early 1850s, the renowned medical journal The Lancet commissioned Dr. Hassall to conduct an unprecedented investigation. Dr. Hassall's weapon was a piece of equipment that was still considered high-tech at the time, the microscope. He randomly purchased thousands of food samples from shops all over London and examined them one by one under the microscope. He saw plaster crystals in bread, strangely dyed particles in tea leaves, roasted chicory root mixed into coffee grounds. He used chemical analysis to detect heavy metals in sweets and condiments. From 1851 to 1854, Yancey published Dr. Hassall's investigative reports in serial form and made a decision that was extraordinarily bold for the time. They directly published the names and addresses of the merchants selling these adulterated foods. This series of reports caused a sensation across society. For the first time, the public could see with shocking clarity exactly what they had been putting into their mouths every day. The enormous pressure of public opinion ultimately pushed Parliament to act. In 1860, Britain passed its first Food Adulteration Act. Although the penalties under this initial law were still quite weak, it set the precedent for using legislation to regulate food safety. According to a report by a London health officer of the time, in one ice cream sample purchased from a street vendor, he found not only vast quantities of bacteria but also lice, bedbugs, bedbug legs, fleas, straw, human hair, and cat and dog fur. Ice cream of this caliber was a significant vector for diseases such as diphtheria and scarlet fever. Regarding the root cause of this scandal, some argue it was primarily the work of a few morally depraved bad actors who would stop at nothing to make a profit. But other scholars, particularly historians heavily influenced by the ideas of Marx and Engels, argue that this was a systemic problem. They point out that in a completely laissez-faire, unregulated capitalist market following the Industrial Revolution, fierce competition inevitably drove merchants to find every possible way to cut costs and increase profit. Food adulteration was the inevitable product of this ruthless logic, a manifestation of bourgeoisie's disregard for the lives of the working class in pursuit of profit. This food scandal revealed a crisis far deeper than the food itself, a crisis of trust. In the small villages of the pre-industrial era, you knew the baker who made your bread and the farmer who milked your cow. The personal relationships between people were themselves a form of quality assurance. But in the anonymous metropolis of the industrial age, you purchased goods produced in factories you could not see from merchants you had never met. This disconnect between producer and consumer provided fertile ground for fraud and adulteration. Dr. Hassall's greatness lay in his use of a new tool to rebuild this trust. His microscope was like a pair of sharp eyes, piercing through the lies of unscrupulous merchants, enabling ordinary consumers to see the truth about their food. This was a transfer of power. Scientific evidence became, for the first time, a weapon for ordinary people against commercial fraud. It heralded the dawn of a new era. In a complex, anonymous modern society, transparency and regulation must be enforced through science and law. Dr. Hassall's microscope not only revealed the contaminants in food, it illuminated the path forward for the modern consumer society. Now let us leave the laboratory and return to the vibrant heart of London. Our destination is the city's great food hubs, the wholesale markets. We're going to smell the air at two of the most famous, Smithfield Meat Market and Billingsgate Fish Market. First, we arrive at Smithfield. Before the mid-19th century, this was London's main live livestock market. You can imagine the scene, thousands of cattle, sheep, and pigs being driven through London's narrow, crowded streets, ultimately converging on this market of nearly 5 acres. The air reeked of animal dung, straw, and the terrified bellowing and squealing of the beasts. The streets were muddy, chaotic, and deafening. For city administrators and residents alike, it was a colossal sanitation and traffic nightmare. And so, in the Victorian era, a great transformation took place. The live livestock market was relocated to the outskirts, and Old Smithfield was rebuilt into a modern new market. You step inside this new market, and your senses are immediately overwhelmed. First, visually, beneath the enormous glass dome, row upon row of iron hooks hold entire sides of pig, beef, and lamb carcasses, forming an endless forest of meat. Workers in blood-stained white aprons haul heavy cuts of meat, weaving through the crowds. The floor is perpetually wet, streaked with blood and wash water. Then, the smell. The air is saturated with a powerful, raw meatiness, a primal, almost visceral odor. Finally, the sound. The dull thud of butchers' cleavers, dividing carcasses, the loud haggling between buyers and sellers, the clatter of handcart wheels rolling over stone, all weaving together into a market symphony. This was a place brimming with masculine energy, a world almost entirely dominated by men. Now let us leave the interior and follow the Thames downstream to Billingsgate Fish Market. If Smithfield's smell was an intense meatiness, then Billingsgate's is an overwhelming brininess. This was the largest fish market in the world at the time. Every day in the early morning hours, fishing boats laden with all manner of seafood would dock. The air was filled with a distinctive odor of seawater, fish scales, and riverbank silt blended together. The scene here was equally spectacular. Cod, haddock, plaice, sole, piled high in mountains, along with countless shellfish and eels. The market's trading method was distinctive, employing a Dutch auction, meaning the auctioneer starts at a high price and calls downward. The first buyer to respond gets the deal. This fast-paced trading style demanded intense concentration from buyers. However, what Billingsgate was most famous for was probably not its fish, but its fishwives. These women who worked in the market were renowned throughout England for their booming voices and their rough, uninhibited language. Their hawking cries, banter with customers, and quarrels with one another formed a unique market culture. When you find yourself amid these two markets, you are struck by their raw vitality. There is none of the polite pretension of upstairs dinner parties, nor the modest tinkling of street vendors. Here is food in its most primal, most wholesale form. These markets were not merely places of trade, they were the urban theaters of Victorian London. Here, people of different classes converged and collided, united by a common purpose. Smithfield's round-the-clock operations witnessed the train drivers arriving in the dead of night, the butchers beginning work before dawn, the white-collar workers arriving in the morning, and the sightseers coming during the day. Their life trajectories briefly intersected in this space. These markets were like the city's unadorned, vigorously beating viscera, revealing London at its most authentic, most visceral, and most dramatic. Having covered the clamor of the markets, let us now go to a quiet, elegant space suffused with the aroma of baked cakes and black tea. Afternoon tea. The protagonist of this story is a lady named Anna Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford-Dark. The time was around 1840, when a subtle but significant change was taking place in the rhythm of upper-class British life. As gaslight became widespread in cities, nightlife grew ever richer, and dinner was pushed later and later, typically not starting until 8 or even 9 o'clock in the evening. This presented the Duchess with a minor but persistent annoyance. Lunch was usually eaten at noon, but dinner wouldn't come until 8 or 9, a gap of 7 or 8 hours. By 4 or 5 in the afternoon, she would invariably feel what she described as a sinking feeling, a wonderfully vivid expression for the fatigue and emptiness brought on by hunger. And so one day, she instructed her servants to prepare a tea tray and bring it to her room. On the tray was a pot of steaming black tea, a few slices of buttered bread, and a cake or two. This simple little repast perfectly bridged that trying afternoon gap. The Duchess quickly fell in love with this new habit and began inviting her close female friends to share it. In a private, exclusively feminine space, they sipped tea, nibbled on treats, and chatted at leisure. As a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria and a central figure in London social circles, the Duchess's new pastime quickly spread among aristocratic ladies and became a fashionable social activity. Gradually, afternoon tea developed a set of fixed conventions. The most classic element is the 3-tiered cake stand. By tradition, you eat from the bottom up. The bottom tier holds savory finger sandwiches, typically filled with cucumber, egg, or smoked salmon. The middle tier is the soul of the English afternoon tea. Scones, served with clotted cream and strawberry jam. The top tier features an assortment of delicate small cakes and pastries. And speaking of afternoon tea, one cannot avoid the topic of drink in Victorian Britain. We must visit 2 diametrically opposed worlds. One, the brilliantly lit, raucously noisy gin palace. The other, the solemn, morally earnest temperance meeting. First, we push open an ornately decorated door and step into a gin palace. You are immediately stunned by the sight. Enormous gas chandeliers flood the interior with light as bright as day. The bar is fashioned from expensive mahogany. Huge mirrors are set into the walls, making the space appear even more expansive and hallucinatory. The air reeks with the acrid blend of cheap gin, tobacco smoke, and sweat. Behind the barkeep pours drinks at a furious pace. Gin, commonly known as Mother's Ruin, was the poor man's water of forgetfulness. In the 18th century, London had endured a terrifying gin craze that nearly destroyed an entire generation. By the Victorian era, although things had improved somewhat, alcoholism in impoverished industrial districts remained extremely serious. For people performing grueling, monotonous labor in terrible conditions, alcohol was the quickest and most affordable escape from reality they could find. But this escape often came at a devastating price. Countless families were plunged into destitution when the man of the house spent his entire wages on drink, and domestic violence and crime rates remained stubbornly high. And so a massive social movement arose, its goal to pull people out of the gin palaces. This was the temperance movement. The temperance campaigners understood that preaching alone was not enough. They had to offer an attractive alternative. So they devised a quintessentially British solution, hosting large, free tea parties. In temperance halls, they laid out long tables heaped with free bread, cakes, and fruit, alongside enormous teapots offering unlimited refills of hot tea. Their message was clear: counter the intoxication and destruction of gin with the warmth and clarity of tea. They even opened temperance bars and temperance billiard halls, offering all the entertainment found in a pub, simply replacing alcoholic drinks with sarsaparilla soda or herbal beverages. This shows that even in that early dawn of consumer society, people had already begun to dimly perceive that to change mass behavior, moral condemnation alone was far from sufficient. You had to offer an equally attractive or even more attractive alternative in the marketplace. This war for the soul of the nation was ultimately fought on the battlefield of consumer choice. And on the Victorian dining table, beyond those serious main courses, there was a category of food that, with its peculiar forms and wobbling textures, added a splash of color to that rigid era. This was the Victorians' near-obsessive love of jellies and puddings. First, jellies. You might think, what's so special about jelly? But in the Victorian era, it was the most technically impressive dessert at any dinner party. This obsession was, once again, a product of the Industrial Revolution. 2 technological developments jointly gave rise to the jelly craze: the advent of cheaply factory-produced gelatin and the maturation of techniques for using powerful stamping presses to punch copper sheets into intricately shaped molds. And so Victorian cooks launched a frenzied competition in edible architecture. The jelly molds they used were complex beyond imagination. Some were designed to resemble Gothic cathedrals or pineapples. Even more astonishing, they invented multi-component molds with internal fittings. For example, a mold called messe d'oeil. It had an internal hollow liner. The cook would first pour a layer of clear jelly between the mold and the liner. Once set, the liner was removed, leaving a cavity in the center of the jelly. Then they would fill this cavity with small, brightly colored pieces of fruit and seal it with more jelly. The result was a translucent jelly with a mosaic-like pattern of fruit suspended within it. And there were even more complex designs. Some molds could produce jellies with internal patterns, such as the cross of the Danish flag or the star of the Order of the Garter, like the Japanese Kintaro Ami candy we know today. No matter where you cut, the pattern remains intact. These trembling, glittering, structurally complex desserts on the dining table were the ultimate showcase of the host's wealth and the cook's skill. Next, let's talk about puddings. The word pudding, for non-British people, is often a source of confusion. In Britain, its meaning is very broad. It can refer to any dessert in general. But pudding also specifically denotes a category of food made by steaming or boiling. And these can be either sweet or savory. The quintessential sweet pudding is the famous spotted dicka dessert, made from suet, flour, milk, and dried fruit, mixed together and steamed in a pudding basin, typically served with custard. The quintessential savory pudding is steak and kidney pudding. Its casing is likewise made from suet and flour, but inside it encases chunks of steak, beef kidney, and a rich gravy. After long hours of steaming, the crust absorbs the essence of the meat juices, becoming soft and flavorful, while the meat inside turns meltingly tender. Beyond jellies and puddings, there is another highly representative food: curry. Curry was not a native British product. It came from the distant colony of India. As more and more British officials, soldiers, and merchants who had worked in India returned home, they brought with them a love for the spicy, aromatic cuisine of India. Before long, eating curry had become fashionable in Britain itself, especially after Queen Victoria was granted the title of Empress of India. This exotic aura, linked to imperial glory, was eagerly embraced by high society. But the British did not adopt curry wholesale. They adapted it to their own tastes and cooking habits, thereby giving birth to a distinctive Anglo-Indian cuisine. You would find some interesting new dishes on the menus of the time. For example, mulligatawny soup. The word comes from the Tamil language of southern India, originally meaning pepper, water, a spicy broth. But the British felt that the lack of a soup course in an Indian meal seemed incomplete, so they invented this dish as a starter for the English formal dinner. They reduced the spiciness, added chicken stock, cream, even apple, making it thicker, milder, and more suited to the British palate. Another famous Anglo-Indian dish is kedgeree. This is a breakfast dish made from smoked haddock, rice, boiled eggs, and curry powder. Its prototype may have been the India khichdi, a porridge of rice and lentils. But the British added their own beloved smoked fish and butter, transforming it into a hearty, exotically tinged English breakfast. For the ordinary middle-class housewife, curry powder also served an extremely practical function. In an age without refrigerators, what to do with the leftover meat from Sunday's roast dinner was a perennial problem. The pungent curry powder could handily mask the flavor of meat that was no longer entirely fresh and give it an entirely new character. Thus, curried leftover meat became a fixture on many families' Monday menus. Besides curry, several other quintessentially British products that we know well today were also born against the backdrop of empire. For example, Worcestershire sauce is said to have been accidentally invented by two pharmacists attempting to recreate a sauce recipe they had tasted in India. And the classic gin and tonic was an invention of British Army officers stationed in India. At the time, to prevent malaria, they needed to take a drug called quinine, but quinine was extremely bitter. To make it more palatable, they mixed it with gin, soda water, and lemon, inadvertently created a cocktail that endures to this day. Well, friends, our Victorian culinary journey is nearing its end. We have seen the poor man's vegetable mush and the rich man's turtle soup, strolled through bustling streets and markets, and witnessed the birth of afternoon tea and the revolution in the food industry. In this final chapter, let us return to the present and see what lasting echoes the Victorian dining table has left on our plates today. You might be surprised to discover that many dining traditions we take for granted today as quintessentially British have their roots planted deeply in Victorian soil. Take, for example, the modern British family Christmas dinner. Although the tradition of celebrating Christmas is ancient, the Christmas scene we know today, a Christmas tree adorned with lights, and a roast turkey or roast goose as the centerpiece of the table, was largely codified in the Victorian era. Credit goes to Queen Victoria and her German husband, Prince Albert, who introduced the German Christmas tree tradition to the British royal court. And the great novelist Charles Dickens, through his work, A Christmas Caroling, shaped the lavish Christmas dinner into a symbol of family togetherness and the spirit of charity, embedding it deep in the public consciousness. Then there is the Sunday roast. Although the history of roasting meat stretches back much further, it was during the Victorian era, with the growth of the middle class and the decline in meat prices, that the whole family sitting down together on Sunday to enjoy a roast dinner with Yorkshire pudding, roast potatoes, and gravy gradually became a fixed, iconic family ritual. And consider Britain's national dish, fish and chips. In the Victorian era, fried fish and fried chips existed as two separate street foods. It was not until the late 19th century that someone first combined them for sale. This simple yet brilliant pairing quickly won the hearts of the working class and ultimately became the food most emblematic of Britain. Not to mention the classic desserts we still enjoy today. The Victoria sponge cake, named after the Queen, the Battenberg cake with its handsome checkered pattern, and the treacle tart, sickeningly sweet yet utterly irresistible. These are all products of Victorian baking, looking back. Was the Victorian era's overall legacy for British cuisine a positive or negative one? One view holds that the Victorian era was a catastrophe for British gastronomy. The urbanization brought by industrialization severed people from the land and made them dependent on factory-produced, standardized, and even adulterated food. The pursuit of efficiency, the craving for convenience, and the middle class's rigid, bland aesthetic all contributed to the decline of traditional British culinary skills, ultimately producing the international image of British food as monotonous, dull, and beyond redemption. But another view argues that the Victorian era was precisely the foundational period of modern British cuisine, an era brimming with innovation and fusion. New technologies, railways, canning brought unprecedented ingredients, imperial expansion brought global flavors, and food popularizers like Mrs. Beeton, through standardized recipes, brought culinary knowledge to a wider audience. From this perspective, the Victorian era did not destroy British cooking, but rather laid a solid foundation for its later diversification. As you conclude this long culinary journey, you realize that the people of the Victorian era were in fact the first generation of modern diners. They were the first to consume branded, industrialized, globalized food on a massive scale. They were the first to feel anxiety over food safety and additives. They were the first to taste flavors from their homeland, the colonies, and every corner of the world at the same table. And they were the first to endow the act of eating with so many complex social functions. Many of our present-day confusions, anxieties, and choices about food, organic versus processed, local versus global, healthy versus convenient, the social meaning of food, the seeds of all these questions, were planted in that distant yet familiar Victorian era. The stories on their plates still resonate with lingering echoes on ours.